Why should I feel discouraged? And why should the shadows come? Why? God calls us to walk with a little bit of a limp, so we call it. There are limps that remind us of who God is in our lives. There are limps in our lives, if we tell it, that remind us that God has done something for us at some point in our lives. There are reminders. These limps are nothing but reminders. They are reminders that God has definitely been good. They are reminders that God has spared you before. They are reminders that God kept your household when you didn't think he could keep it. They are reminders that God got you that degree when you didn't think you could finish up the curriculum. They are reminders that God spared your child in the midst of that circumstance. They are reminders that God is still with you regardless of how it feels right now. Those limps are reminders of the inner aches and pains we've had that kept us from doing some things in our lives. Those limps are reminders that those inner aches and pains did not take us over. Those limps are reminders that when the people on our job tried to take our jobs, when the people on the street tried to take our lives, they are reminders that they could not do what they desired to do because there is a God that lives within you that is more powerful than them. So I want you to embrace your limp today. I want you to embrace the limp that God has given you. It might be just that you are a little more cautious as you take your step forward into certain things because you are reminded of what happened last time that you stepped into that situation. It's going to be a reminder that maybe I should not be taking drugs. It's going to be a reminder that maybe I shouldn't drink any more liquor. It's going to be a reminder that keeps you safe from the things that caused you harm at one point in your life. But God give us these limps because the limp comes into our spirit and it stops us when we get ready to do something that God has ordained for us not to do in our lives. Now Jacob, if you know the story of Jacob had some concerns in his life. Jacob was not a perfect man, just like we're not perfect men and women. Jacob was born into a family that was promised a lot by God. Jacob's father Isaac was promised from his father Abraham that he would have many nations come out of them, right? But Jacob, even with all this promise to him, he had some concerns in his life. And where did these concerns come from? The concerns came from the way that his life went. If you remember the life of Jacob, Jacob had deceived his brother. Jacob had stolen his brother's blessing. He stole his birthright first and then his blessing. And because he stole these things, Jacob lived in fear. Jacob lived in fear of losing his very life. And beyond living in fear of losing his very life, he probably felt a little disrespectful to his father because his father died knowing that he stole his brother's birthright. So even though there was so much promise to him, there were things that stood in his way. There were concerns that stood in his way. Jacob had some concerns that seemed to put him in a place of worry. Let's consider his life all over again. The life he had so far, before Jacob took this journey that we're reading about, the journey that he brought his wives and his wives' servants on and his children on, the journey going back to his home, the journey going to meet his brother. Before he took this journey, we have to consider the fact that he was born second to his brother Esau, yet he stole his brother's birthright for food. His mother favored him and helped him to deceive his father on his dying bed and steal his brother's blessing. When his brother found out he stole his blessing, his brother said, "After I bury my father, I will take your very life." So Isaac, after Isaac died, his mother, the mother sent Jacob out to her brother Laban to go find her brother Laban so he can find a wife to marry and so he can get away from his brother Esau so he would not be killed by his brother Esau. So when he went to Laban, Laban was dishonest. Laban made him work 7 years for a wife that he was not promised. He made him work for his daughter Leah, which was the older daughter, and this is not the daughter that he promised to give to Jacob. So here it is, he deceived, and now he's being deceived. And Laban now tells him he says, I'll give you the other wife after a week of, marriage with my first wife, with the first daughter, but you have to work 7 more years. So here it is, he has to work 14 years to get the wife that he was promised in the first place. Now tell me that, you don't have to pay back for some of the things that you've done in your life. God allows us to pay back for some things. But Jacob is doing a lot of paying back here, and it's giving him some concerns. He's paying back with 14 years of labor for 2 wives to get the one wife that he wanted. And what you don't know or don't maybe not remember is that when he got the second wife, she was barren. God made her barren because of what Jacob had done. So God had been giving Jacob some punishments all along the way. So his first wife had 6 sons. First had 4 sons and then came back and had 2 more later after one of his maids had two sons. So here it is, he's getting a lot of children, but he yet had no children from the wife that he wanted. And then finally, God blessed Rachel and gave her the wife that he wanted and gave her 1 child. And in the midst of all this that he's going through and all that's going on, in the back of his mind, I believe kept resonating the fact that he had deceived his brother and his brother wanted to kill him. And here he is living in a foreign land, living on land that was not promised to him, living on land where he was being used. Here it is on Laban's land. Jacob had to work the land just to get the wives, and beyond working the land to get the wives, he says, now I need to own something for myself. He starts working the land for 6 more years. So 20 years of Jacob's life is going to waste at on Laban's land. 20 years of the time that God had promised that he would be powerful. 20 years of the time that God had promised that he would be a father of nations and that his sons and his children would lead the world. Here it is, time is being wasted. 20 years, he spent 6 more years working for Laban, while Laban deceived him constantly, working for Laban to get flock, to get sheep, to get animals of his own, so he had something to own for himself, because ownership made you somebody in those days. So he needed to have his own ownership, and he went ahead and listened to God. But the whole time that he's going through this, it's 20 years. So it seemed like Jacob was wrestling with God just for one night, but I say that he was wrestling with God for the whole 20 years that he had been away, because God had been speaking to him in the midst of everything that had taken place. Even though he was delayed in getting the wife he wanted, he eventually got that wife. Even though it was delayed in him getting a child that he wanted from that wife, he eventually got children, two sons from the wife he wanted. Even though it was delayed in him getting any kind of property or land for himself, he eventually got some property and some land, till he got to the place where he says, God, enough is enough. This delay is enough. And he decided that he was going to go back home. And on the way back home, the scripture we read is talking about a night that he decided to spend with God by himself. How many people know that there comes a time when you got to get away by yourself with God? There comes a time when you can't talk to your best friend. There comes a time when you can't talk to your mother or your father about the stuff going on in your life. There comes a time when you can't even trust your confidant who lays on the pillow next to you in the bed and tell them about what's going on with you, because they just don't understand. I tell you, I've been through some stuff lately that, I thought I have this one friend that is my closest friend in the world, and I thought that we could talk about everything in the world. But the things that I have been encountering lately, whenever we speak about it, I've gotten to the place now where I have to just say, you know what, she just doesn't understand. Because God does that. You know why he does that? Because he wants to remind you that he's the only one that can understand every iota of stuff that happens within your life. He is the only one at some point in your life that you can seek. He is the only one that you can talk to at some point in your life. And I've learned to walk and talk to God. I've learned to drive my car and talk to God. I've learned to find those moments when I'm by myself and talk to God. I've learned to make him my true confidant. You know how they used to say, you know, that you called on your best friend and they weren't there, and then you had to call on Jesus. I'm learning what that means. When the elders in the church sang that back in the days, I didn't quite understand it, but I'm at the place now where I'm learning what that means. And I believe Jacob was at that place where Jacob knew he had to have a conversation with God. So Jacob decided to allow his family to go one way, and then he found time to be with God. And for that night, he endured. The time with God can get a little dull sometimes. Don't you agree? Don't you agree that you could be praying and sometimes fall asleep? Don't you agree that you could be praying and you said, oh my goodness, wasn't I just praying? All of a sudden, all kinds of thoughts just creep up in your mind. The time with God can get to be a distracted time sometimes. And that's why I believe that the Bible refers to this situation as wrestling with God. Because Jacob had some things he had to bring to God. It's not that he hadn't talked to God before. It's not that God hadn't helped him get the wife that he wanted. It's not that God hadn't helped him to allow his wife to have children. It's not that God hadn't allowed him to get those spotted cows and spotted animals to feed right and become the better animals on Laban's land, and so that Jacob had the animals that were prosperous. It wasn't that God hadn't put in his parents in Jacob's life before, but it was just that there was some stuff in the back, in the recess of Jacob's life, that he needed God to work on. Some of us got some things in the recess of our lives that, if we tell the truth, we've been walking with them a long time. We've been dealing with the same situations for a long time. We've been unfaithful for a long time to some people in our lives. We've been mean to some people in our lives for a long time. Sometimes it's hard to talk about the things we're doing, but sometimes we got issues that have made us into trouble in other people's lives. There are some things that we have done that we have not repented of. There are some things that we continue to do that God tells us that we need to come out of, that we are not coming out of. And because we continue to be in those things, no matter how much money you make, no matter how many people smile in your face, no matter how many people tell you how wonderful you are and how great you look, there's an issue with you being contented. There's an issue with you being able to sleep and rest well at night. There's an issue with you being able to just be happy with yourself like you are. And that issue comes from unresolved things that are in your life. We all got some unresolved issues. You don't have to tell me about them. You don't even have to admit to having them, because I know you got them, because I got some too. So Jacob decided that it was time to deal with some of these unresolved issues. So in addition to finding and seeking out time to be with God, Jacob decided that he was going to endure the time with God. Because Jacob wrestled with God, or should I say endured in prayer until he had a limp, he became powerful over the rest of his life. Jacob's limp was a sign of his endurance in prayer with God. How many of you have been enduring in prayer with God? How many of you have spent more than 10 minutes at a time praying to God? Because you know 10 minutes can seem pretty long when you're praying. I don't know why. It don't seem long when I'm doing anything else. But when I get to praying, 10 minutes can seem like a long time. So I want you to push yourself. Go beyond your boundaries. Try to spend more than 10 minutes in prayer when you talk to God. Endure and listen to God for a minute. And because Jacob endured and he wrestled with God in this prayer, he became powerful, like I said. Jacob's limp was a sign of his endurance. And Jacob went to God with his concerns. Here it is, he can go to God with his concerns. His biggest concern was being able to be back with his brother and have his brother forgive him for what he had done unto him. Now, our concerns are different, but Jacob brought his concern to God. He went to God with his fear of encountering his brother again. He went to God because he knew that if anybody could fix this encounter and make this encounter right, it would be God. He didn't go to his best friend. He didn't take it to Laban. He didn't take it to his wives. He went to God. And because he endured, Jacob not only prevailed in the wrestling with God, but he received power to deal with his concerns. He also received power to stand in front of his brother Esau and be accepted when he thought for all these years that he was rejected by his brother because of the actions that he had taken. Now all of us have probably got some people that we have had years of separation from. We have had years of not talking to some people. We have had years of holding some people responsible for things that have happened in our lives that probably should have happened anyway and would have happened anyway. So we got to go back and look at some of those things and find out, are we in the place that Jacob was in? Are we stuck even though it seems like we're moving? Are we like in quicksand and our feet are not going anywhere even though it looks like we have been all over the world? Sometimes we're stuck because we have not yet done what God has called us out to do. And sometimes it's not just that we haven't been talking to somebody. Sometimes God has called us to do things. God has called us to work in the church. God has called us to change the lives of people in our neighborhood and change the lives of people in our households. Yet we sit there and we will not say a word. Yet we sit there and we will not do what God has called us out to do. And God allows us to go through some time where we are going to get a limp, because he's going to allow us to suffer something while he waits for us to do what he calls us to do. Notice that when Jacob wrestled with God, God took him in the side, in his hip, and held his hip. And because he held his hip, Jacob came out with a limp. And even when he got this limp, so even though you've suffered a little bit and got through some stuff and got into some stuff, God is saying that the fight is not over. He's saying that if you continue to wrestle with me, if you continue to pray to me, if you continue to trust me, even with this limp, the limp is just a reminder that you have to keep praying. The limp is just a reminder that you have to keep coming to God. And when you bless him in spite of your situation, when Jacob continued to wrestle and pray even though his hip was out of socket, when Jacob made that limp into a blessing in his life, Jacob came out victorious. Jacob came out, and when he went to meet his brother, when he went out to meet Esau, Esau wondered why Jacob was afraid. Here it is, Esau had forgotten or just forgiven Jacob a long time ago while Jacob was carrying this situation. I believe that in our own very lives, we've held on to some things too long as well. We've held on to things beyond the time that God wanted us to hold on to them. And if we just let go of them, we will become victorious in the midst of the situation. In the midst of just walking with God, thinking we are on the right track, we have made it through, he made it through the rough roads. Then a new, even more intense journey presents itself. In the midst of you journeying with God, in the midst of you deciding that you're going to stay with God in spite of what's happening in your life, in spite of the fact that I got to come to church and I don't know if I have enough to give an offering. I got to come to church and you know, my job wants me to work on Sunday. In spite of it, you make it on the day that you are off and you try to get here just the same. You keep pushing even though it doesn't look like your finances are going to meet ends, and you keep pushing because you know that the journey with God becomes even better as you continue to journey. So here it is, Jacob gets to a place now where he's reconciled with his brother Esau, and now he can go back and take the land that was a blessing to him. He can go back and have his father's land. He can go back and live freely now on the land that he was promised to be given. Here it is, he purchased land of his own and he started a life of his own. He was no longer imprisoned by Laban and Laban's needs and Laban's thoughts and what Laban wanted to do, because he took a step forward and he wrestled with God. And because he wrestled with God, if I could explain the journey a little further, if you know about the 12 tribes of Israel, they come from Jacob. Jacob's 12 sons are the 12 tribes of Israel. So as we continue to read the word of God, all we read about are the 12 tribes of Israel. It's the different tribes that come out of the children that Jacob bore. Now, how could that all happen if Jacob did not wrestle with God? What a blessing that came from Jacob wrestling with God. There's sometimes demons in our lives. There's sometimes demons in our life that take a grip on us. And these particular demons, they hold on to us and they cause us pain sometimes. And sometimes they make us think we're down for the count. Sometimes they make us think that, you know, we can't come back now. Sometimes it has an effect on us that make us think that we are never going to be able to be prosperous or do the things that God said that we would do at some point in our lives. But let me tell you here that Jacob overcame because of his wrestling with God. And if we could take some time to wrestle with God, we can also be reminded that God has already answered some prayers that we lifted up to him. And because he's already answered some prayers, it is a reminder that if he brought you through that, he can bring you through this. It is a reminder that because he has kept you before, he will surely keep you again. When you thought that you could not make it over the last circumstance, when you thought that that circumstance was not going to end in a good result, God made it happen anyway. Guess who did it? God did it. Because God did it, you are reminded when the next time comes, you stand up tall and you look around at your circumstance and you say, it's all right because I got this limp. I got this limp that reminds me that God has got my back. I got this limp that reminds me that God did it before and he's going to do it again. You can look at your limp and say, thank you, God, for the limp, because the limp is a reminder of how God continues to bless you in spite of your circumstance. The blessing. Now, I said there's a blessing in the limp. If you look at Genesis chapter 49, verses 1 through 27, you can't really read it now, but Jacob, it's a prophetic poem that Jacob describes his 12 sons. And he kind of gives them the blessing that they will have throughout their lives. And when we think of the tribes of Israel being led by the 12 sons of Jacob, then the limp is nothing in comparison to what Jacob ended up doing. The limp, it will remind you to make you say like David, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. So if you got some enemies and you think that they're going to take you over, and you think that you have no way of beating them, then I want you to be reminded of the limp that God has put into your life. Because I know that you have wrestled with God at some point in your life. I know God has showed you something in some point of your life that let you know the only person in here that probably didn't have too many circumstances is probably Mariah and Mila, that haven't had too many circumstances to prove to them that God is good. We have some reminders. We have a limp. When you think about this limp that God has put into your life, be reminded that in the midst of your storm, you could be reminded that God is a blessed assurance. The song says, blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory. When you can be reminded that there is glory to come, when you can be reminded that God is still working on your behalf, then you can shout in the midst of your storm. Then the limp won't have any effect except to be a reminder in your life of how good God is. The limp reminds you of God's promise to bless you. And even when you have been waiting for a long time, you will wrestle in prayer with God and say, this too shall pass, because this too shall pass. If Jesus could take his situation to the Garden of Gethsemane and say to God, listen, I'm hurting. Listen, I'm in pain. Listen, I don't know how I'm going to make it through this. Can you make this go from me? If Jesus can take that to God and wrestle with God in the Garden of Gethsemane, who are we that we don't want to wrestle with God? Who are we that we're going to allow circumstances and situations that have been in our lives? Some of these things have been in our lives for just an hour. Some of them have been in there for 20, 30 years. But who are we to allow these things to take us over? Who are we when we call ourselves children of God to allow these things to make us into people who are fearful, to make us into people who don't trust God? When I think about the state of our country right now, when I think about the leadership and all that we have endured, not just as colored people, not just as Hispanic people, not just as, women in this country. When I think of all that our people have endured, and some people want to give up the fight. Some people want to say, well, we might as well just be supporters of the leadership. I'm not going to do that, because I have a God that I can continue to wrestle with. I have a God that gave me a limp that reminds me that he's going to take us through and take us over this, just like he's taken us through and take us over many things before. It's the same God that allowed you when you were in labor and going through and thinking that you weren't going to make it, having that baby, that allowed you to have that healthy baby that's growing up now. That's the same God that is still in charge of our country right now. It's the same God that when the doctors gave you a write-off and said that you weren't going to make it, that God has allowed you to continue to live. It's the same God that when they told you that you could not get a certain achievement in your life, that you could not make it into a job, when they told you that you were going to become nothing, it's that same God that has put the limps in your life that are blessings to you, that remind you of who God is. I don't know about you, but I trust God more and more every day. I don't know about you, but I'm bringing my concerns to him. I don't know about you, but I'm walking with him daily, and I'm willing to wrestle. I'm willing to spend all night talking to God. I'm willing to give myself over to him, because I know what is inside of him. I know what he can do. I just want to thank God. And as I think about it, I'm reminded of the fact that even though I've had some hills to climb, even though I've had some rough roads, even though I continue to anticipate roads to come, I'm reminded that this is a God of justice. This is a God of righteousness. We may not be in a country right now that seems very just. We may not be in a country right now that seems very right every time we listen and open the news and hear what is being said on TV. But I'm here to remind you today that we serve a God that's a God of justice. So no matter what your situation may be, no matter what has held you back all these years, no matter what is your limp in your life that tells you that you might not be able to walk anymore, God has said, walk victorious, my child. God has said, it's going to be well with your soul. God has said, take it to me in prayer. And if you learn to take it to him, if you learn to keep trusting on him, then he's going to make it well. And you too can say, this too shall pass. Amen.
Should my heart feel lonely and long for heaven and home, when Jesus is my portion, a constant friend is he. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. Let's take it up again.